Greetings everyone, my name is Raziel and today we're looking at Kheron Ophion. Ophion is the rare warlord of the Night Lords, finally becoming a collectible warlord in the Hidden Dagger expansion after being an event warlord for multiple years prior, as well as appearing in the warlord pool for the Kalidas Assassin for some limited time. Compared to his brethren, Ophion does play a little different. Most Night Lord decks are fairly aggressive, able to push for loads of damage with the likes of Sevatar, Strix and Gendor, or are trying to abuse murder to their full effect with Conrad Curse. Ophion, however, he is taking a step back. His Battlehonour allows him to protect the usually frail Night Lord troops, opening the way for a midrange deck that excels at board control. With that, let's take a look at the deck. For the most part, this probably looks like a reasonably standard Night Lords deck. And you would be correct in that assessment. For the most part, these are simply the standard Night Lords cards you see in basically every deck, and for good reason. Goodel and Thrax Squad are a menace when it comes to reactive board control early on, Radesk Squad is a very obnoxious card to deal with in general, and Contekar Dissident can snowball out of control very quickly, just to name a few examples. However, there are a couple of cards in here that you usually don't see in most Night Lord decks. Given we lack the built-in card draw of warlords like Sevatar, we are running a number of cards to fix that. Factory Overdrive once again serves as a valuable draw tool, accompanied by Arvos Lighter, which also doubles as emergency healing, as well as an option to squeeze warlord ability to shield yourself into your turns, as well as Urban Warfare for our anti-stealth tech, which also draws us into our troops. A little more out of the box is Ulan Huda. Night Lord's vehicles are pretty strong. And with Nightblade Rhino, we also have a fairly strong option for Ophion in particular in the pool, so using it to draw into our vehicles is a nice and cheap option. In general, all of these tools help improve consistency and make for a good use of our early game energy, as the Night Lord's card pool sadly doesn't really have any troops worth protecting with Ophion in the 1 to 3 energy slot, apart from Goodel, who is a one-off legendary. In fact, this is the one downside to the Night Lords in general nowadays. There really is not a whole lot of reasonably cheap options that are worth protecting. You're basically limited to precisely Goodel, Thrak and Radesk Squad. Everything else is more expensive, like Contekar Dissident. Cards like Orma Veterans getting nerfed to no longer affect your warlord also really hurts Ophion, who now has to suffer for the sins of his brethren. Overall though, the deck does perform quite well and is a nice breath of fresh air from the usual Night Lord shenanigans to some extent. That concludes the quick breakdown of the deck. If you want a deeper analysis, check out the deck paste in the description or join the Discord server. With that, enjoy the games.
found it! Science grace! That left a mark!
The old brothers, a constant enemy.